Okay, welcome everybody to our final session. And we excited about this talk. Want to introduce Brett Beasley, who is the Associate Director for the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership. And Brett's talk today is going to be about recovering Newman's epistemology for a post-truth era. And so I think we're ready to dive right in. Brett, welcome, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you everybody for battling the Zoom fatigue and sticking with it and being here for this talk. I really, really appreciate it. And so let me just say by way of introduction, so as you heard, I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Ethical Leadership. So that's one area of my research is in applied and practical ethics. But I'm also originally trained as a Victorianist. So this paper for me does something that I don't usually get to do in my work, which is bring those two things together. So really, as we as a Center for Ethical Leadership at Notre Dame, we're looking into this problem that a lot of leaders and organizations were having with how to weed out false information, how to share good information, how to establish trust. I found a lot of the thinking really lacking. Having read Newman, I saw a lot of areas in which his thought could really inform or deepen discussions or question some of the assumptions that were often made in the literature about truth judgments and selfhood and influence, areas that were all very important to Newman. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share these ideas with you, and I welcome your feedback. So I'll only speak for maybe 20 or 25 minutes and give us plenty of time for discussion. And I recognize that the works I'm going to be discussing and drawing from, so mostly the Grammar of Assent, but also the Oxford University Sermons, these are nearly bottomless, suggestive works. So due to the applied nature, you might say, of this talk, I'll approach them very partially and selectively as they prove relevant to this particular problem. But I certainly welcome, your insights about other aspects of these works or other works that might have some bearing on this problem. So to get started, are we living in a post-truth era? If I was to ask all of you, at least more than half of you would say yes. I've done a survey of this, a simple question similar to that, and had something like 98% of people say, yes, we are living in some sort of post-truth era. So there does tend to be widespread agreement about this underlying experience that we're all having. So 50% of Americans, according to Pew Research Center, see fabricated news or information as a very big problem in our country today. In 2016, the Oxford Dictionary selected post-truth as its word of the year. And their definition is really interesting. They define it as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So two interesting words that have a specific meaning for Newman: personal and objective. I think he'll advise us, to see the problem slightly differently from that definition, actually. So then the year after that, 2017, the American Dialect Society chose the term fake news, related term, as its word of the year. And their definition was disinformation or falsehood presented as real news. So yet, despite the increasingly widespread use of these terms, fake news and post-truth, there really is little agreement about the causes and the consequences of the phenomenon that they're describing. So we can see here the post-truth condition. This is what we can agree on. Most people think about the saturation of falsehoods, that there's just too many untruths around us to debunk. Maybe they're also referring to the speed. So studies show that fake news, false information spreads more rapidly online, and also that it travels further. So we're reaching a critical mass of disinformation or misinformation. So that's what we agree on. But there's disagreement about the causes. So in doing some surveys and in reading other surveys on this, here's who people say is to blame. So a lot of people blame people they see as gullible. Depending on who you are, who you see as gullible might differ. So the people sharing the fake news, sometimes it's that the view is that they lack critical thinking skills or are blinded by ideology in some way. People will also mention, and I had a lot of this in recent survey data, so they'll blame specific politicians or the media. Again, depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on, the other side is probably to blame in your view. And sometimes the media pushing some kind of political agenda is also blamed. And then quite common in connection with the other two, or sometimes on its own, is the view that technology itself is to blame. So on this view, the rise of, broadly speaking, the internet, but then of course, social media, the ability to manipulate images or create deep fake video, things like that are themselves to blame. So that's probably the most common blame for the post-truth era. And yet I think that's actually the one that would make Newman seem the least relevant, right? That Newman would be on the other side of some kind of digital divide. What could Newman possibly have to say about these technologies that he obviously could not have even foreseen? And yet, if we think about Newman's motto, his famous motto, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaks unto heart. Newman's motto asks us to speak personally, from the core of our being, out of care, concern, and attention to another person as other. Could a man with such a motto have anything to say to an era that seems to be defined by a very different type of conversation? It takes very little acquaintance with the state of conversation in contemporary society to find communication not ad cor, not from the heart, but rather from bias, bigotry, or blind ideology, not so much spoken as shouted, or said snidely or combatively, and not to the heart of the other, as other, but rather as some sort of representative of a political, ethnic, or ideological group. Another way to ask this question then is it really appropriate or even helpful to think about Newman as having anything to say to us, or is he hopelessly, any appeal to him, is it hopelessly nostalgic or irrelevant? I'm going to claim that it's not, of course, and I'm going to point to 6 ways in which a Newman-inspired approach to the post-truth era might be very helpful, both for framing the problem and then assessing a number of possible solutions, you might say. But by solutions, we might not be, fixing the broad social problem so much as coping with it, learning to live with character and integrity in this kind of dysfunctional information ecosystem. So we're going to talk about reframing the problem, recognizing the limits of inference and what the implications of that would be, focusing on the human person as the privileged site of knowing and understanding the world, talking about certitude and recognizing the ways in which excessive certitude is probably not the best way to characterize the problem of the post-truth era, and then talk about affirming conscience, and then remoralizing or bringing back moral content to the idea of sharing information with other people. So first of all, to reframe the problem a little bit. As I mentioned a minute ago, if we think of the problem as a merely technical problem, and if we adopt a kind of technological determinism that says this problem was created by technologies and it didn't exist before these technologies, then it would seem as though Newman is really not relevant to us at all. And yet, this is the much broader way I would go about determining why Newman really is a saint for the post-truth season. People probably know Charles Taylor's book, Sources of the Self. There's a really wonderful section of that called Our Victorian Contemporaries. And what Taylor says there is that the Victorians are so close to us in their moral outlook and in their strategies for understanding their worlds. Because when we seek to understand or change our cultures, ourselves, or our morals, we still reach back to the old vocabularies, he calls them. He thinks that to be a modern person, and the Victorians were kind of the first version of this, of who we are today, we have to deal with these twin heritages of the Enlightenment and Romanticism. So that's what makes them our contemporaries. And I would argue that that is what makes Newman our contemporary, even in this moment, despite the fact that he could not have foreseen some of the technologies we're thinking about. But Newman really was operating, trying to reconcile these two very different traditions. They're probably the representative figures for him would be Locke, of course, who he engages with extensively in the Grammar of Assent, but then possibly Wordsworth, let's say, or Coleridge from the Romantic side. And he describes in the Apologia per Vita Sua his engagement with these sort of Romantic poets. So these two sides he expresses a great deal of respect for and tries to adjudicate the ethics of belief that each side represents. What views do you have a right to hold? What kind of evidence or information would you need in order to be able to legitimately hold those beliefs? So I think by placing the post-truth phenomenon within this long, long history of these two vocabularies and the ways that the Victorians, and Newman in particular as an excellent example of someone who did something that I think almost no one else could have done, finding a way to reconcile these two and to forge a true ethics of belief that accounted for both of these vocabularies. So let's dive a little bit then into what do I mean by that, and what would be some of the implications. So one topic that is important in the Grammar of Assent is inference, and especially when Newman wants to point out the limits of inference. One of the things that means, and when we talk about inference, as people know who have read this work, but maybe not everybody has, Newman is especially talking about any linear process of coming to hold a belief. When you start in a state of uncertainty and you grow increasingly toward greater and greater, you accrue evidence, and you gradually recognize the greater probability of this being true. And this is helpful because if you look around in the articles, both in the popular press and in the academic community, what you'll find is that science, or possibly even a kind of scientism, we might say, is often suggested as the cure for the post-truth era. And I mentioned, I kind of flagged in that Oxford definition, the definition framed the whole problem as people focused not enough on the objective and too much on the subjective side. But Newman has a lot of things to say about why we need both. And so just as some examples of the people who are calling for greater attention to, greater respect for science as the solution, and in that sense follow that kind of Oxford definition. So the most popular and most widely cited academic account of the post-truth era is the book Post-Truth by Lee McIntyre from MIT Press out in 2018. And he really sees science denial as the core of the problem and really the germ of the post-truth era that started many decades ago, in his view, where science, he claims, enjoyed much greater respect and was systematically undermined throughout a lot of the 20th century. So he sees science denial as the main way to understand what's going on in the post-truth era. Interestingly, too, Daniel Lapsley, who's a psychologist here at Notre Dame, and Challoner, see the solution as cultivating in education a kind of science identity where people feel more connected to, they don't feel alienated from science. And so they think that would be more a longer game, right? But to instill that science identity throughout a person's education. And I think during the coronavirus crisis, this sense that fake news, what we mean by fake news or disinformation or the post-truth era, it's been increasingly linked with pseudoscience being shared online, anti-science conspiracies, various kinds of quack cures and things like that. So I think the coronavirus crisis has accelerated the post-truth phenomenon in so many ways, and this is certainly one of them, that it has increasingly made it appear that the core might be science denial. But as Newman says, and he has a lot of comments about science, because as people probably know, one of the main impetuses for him to write the book as it was written was his friend William Froude, who claimed that had a sort of scientific approach to life and he held doubts to be sacred. And what Newman was trying to do in some ways was a very personal approach to Froude, to show all the ways in which science was not sufficient. So a kind of famous quotation from the Grammar of Assent. So he says, science has too much simplicity and exactness from the nature of the case to be the measure of fact. So there's lots of facts that fall outside the purview of science. And he says, in its very perfection, so to properly esteem science for what it is and what it can do, in its very perfection lies its incompetency to settle particulars and details. As to logic, its chain of conclusions hangs loose at both ends, he says, kind of famous quotation from the Grammar of Assent. And I think this is increasingly something we see as people try to use a purely scientific view in the coronavirus crisis to make decisions about, should my institution open? Should I have my wedding if I'm getting married, right? In some ways you can be informed by the science, but also I think everyone who's having to make these types of decisions is also in many cases coming to an awareness of exactly what Newman is talking about, that science can't get you all the way to application, and it also doesn't provide the first principles on which it stands. So let's talk then about what would be Newman's solution. If the solution is not just being better at inferences, being better at being objective, and adopting a more scientific approach, then what is Newman's solution? And it would certainly be personalist, would probably be the best way to describe it, a word that is increasingly applied to Newman. So, as Newman says in the Grammar of Assent, and he in some ways is responding to the idea that we ought to become more scientific in our ways of thinking, he says, we must take the constitution of the human mind as we find it, and not as we may judge it ought to be. So what he's especially saying there is we ought not to try to form our minds into being just reasoning machines, just dealing completely objectively with the world or abstractly with the world. We ought to take the mind as we find it. And I think part of what he's getting at there too is we shouldn't lament the fact that our minds operate this way, that it's not always an inherent weakness. In fact, it's part of what makes us able to function in the worlds that we live in. So interestingly, there's a real convergence here between what Newman is talking about and what contemporary psychologists are finding as they continue to investigate truth judgments in the post-truth world. So Newman says, another excellent just gem from the Grammar of Assent, life is not long enough for a religion of inferences. So we would never get around to, if we have to have commitments that we live our lives from, we would never get around to making those commitments if we had to approach them slowly, methodically, incrementally, by coming to a greater sense that this is probably true. So this is very much in line with what contemporary psychologists talk about in terms of us using heuristics. not just in matters of religion, but in all types of areas of our lives. So for one, if you look at the base rates side, so one of the biases we have is to believe things. We tend to believe things, especially images, more than we disbelieve them. And you can see that as a kind of adaptation to an environment in which we, before the post-truth era especially, could believe most of what we encountered. We weren't actively being lied to most of the time, right? There was not such things as manipulated images and things like that. So our minds set a certain base rate. And you think about how difficult life would be if you constantly had to mistrust everything that you see. You wouldn't be able to live that way, right? And similarly, we use feelings, especially fluency. And that's the more that you hear something said over and over again, the illusory truth effect, that's called, it becomes fluent. It becomes easy for your mind to conceptualize that. And that can work as a heuristic that leads you to a truth judgment. And also memories, of course, this is well known, where you tend to believe things that line up with what you already know or sources that you already trust. So in that sense, I like to think about this quote, probably my favorite from the Grammar of Assent. And he talks about science, again, as having very little of the religious tendency. He says deductions, that thing that we do once we get to the end of our logical process of assembling, fact and reasoning, they have no power of persuasion, he says. The heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma. No man will be a martyr for a conclusion. So it is both a wonderful example of Newman's best prose at work, but also just a statement of basic fact in light of exactly what we see in a diagram like this. Like it is literally true that persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us, that we are moved in our lives to commitments in ways that this process of deduction could never get us to, and we wouldn't be able to function very well as people if we didn't live out of these commitments. So then you might think that certitude, Newman uses the term certitude, okay? His vocabulary is a little Victorian, I guess, right? So certitude, which is just similar to certainty, but there's a lot of reasons to think that that's not the underlying problem then of the post-truth era at all. And this flies in the face of a lot of what you will sometimes hear. These are certainly realities that drive the post-truth phenomenon, and yet they may not be the full explanation of what's going wrong or how we might work to fix it. So there's the creation of epistemic bubbles. So that's when you naturally gravitate toward like-minded people. I think it's helpful to remember this researcher, Etienne Brown, describes people like this as information hobbits, becoming a little bit too comfortable with what they already know. And then there's also echo chambers, which are more radical and act to actively silence other people. And so one typical approach is to try to break up these epistemic bubbles or break up these echo chambers. But it's especially in the case of echo chambers that are more hostile, people often become more entrenched, especially if they're challenged directly on their beliefs, especially in that more inference style approach. So Newman has an interesting insight about this in his discussion of certitude. And what Newman has to say about it is that the problem is not certitude, but rather an incomplete certitude. So he says that irritation and impatience of contradiction, vehemence of assertion, determination to silence others, sounds a lot like the comments section of a thread on an article or something, right? So he says these are the tokens of a mind which has not yet attained the tranquil enjoyment of certitude. So certitude is not the thing that makes you attack other people. It's actually a lack of certitude. And he spends some time in the Grammar of Assent talking about what are the types of emotions that would attend real certitude. And he talks about having a sense of peace, a sense of tranquility, not chasing down and attacking other people literally or just verbally. So not having to be combative. And this is a person who described himself as a controversialist, right? So Newman is not saying don't challenge or don't have zeal for things you think are true. But this excessive hostility, he thinks won't be the product of actual certitude. So certitude and conscience, really the point for Newman is that these are normal operations of the mind. So sometimes it might seem like he's talking about something extra special, but he's really talking about common ways, as we saw in that chart, these like heuristics that we use to live our lives. So then moving on to the fifth point about conscience, something that gets discussed quite a bit in the Grammar of Assent. So one of the ways that we tend to approach other people, as I kind of mentioned at the outset, is as mere representatives of an ideology or having certain views because of what group they belong to. And Newman is an interesting person to appeal to in this way, because not only is Newman a great example of strong faith and deep conviction, but also a person who changed his mind. He wrote the Apologia Pro Vita Sua in part to prove how genuinely he changed his mind. And so people probably know the famous quote, "To live is to change, to be perfect is to change often." So Newman was also in favor of change and believed deeply in other people's ability to change. And part of the reason why is because of conscience. So conscience, of course, though, is not just, it's not creative in the sense that I can't create my own truth just by having a conscience. Taking the dictate of my conscience doesn't make something true for me. But here's how Newman describes it. It's really that when you see someone else as having a conscience, you recognize them as being a person with judgment and a person really with a connection to the divine. So he sees conscience as being our kind of most proximate connection with God. So he says conscience is concerned with persons primarily, and with actions mainly as viewed in their doers, or rather with self alone and one's own actions, and with others only indirectly and as if in association with the self. So it's the phrase that Pope John Paul II would, in some ways, probably inspired by Newman, but always talk about the perspective of the acting person and following conscience. So here again is Newman from the Grammar of Assent. Conscience is a personal guide, and I use it because I must use myself. I am as little able to think by any mind but my own as to breathe with another's lungs. Conscience is nearer to me than any other means of knowledge. And so the ability that someone like Newman would have to legitimately change his mind, and I think we have to have this kind of approach if we are going to be controversialists like Newman and take stands for things we believe in and legitimately attempt to influence other people. We have to see them as having a conscience, something that would help them stand out from whatever ideology might be guiding them and informing their lives in some way, but they still have some ability to change, some other kind of access to truth, and aren't just the blind conformists of some ideological position. So then, and finally, remoralizing the act of sharing. So one of the interesting research findings is not always, it's that people don't always, when they share things that are untrue, even believe the things that they share. One of the interesting findings to come out of the last couple of years. And in fact, people do believe in general that it's somewhat immoral to share a fake news headline or something like that. There's a study on this called Misinformation and Morality. If you want to see it, I could send it to you. But one of the issues with that is after being exposed to fake news or misinformation headlines over and over again, the amount that they see it as immoral wanes. So they see it as less and less immoral the more that they're exposed to it. So it kind of erodes our sense that I'm even engaging in some kind of moral act at all when I'm sharing whatever information I'm sharing. So people often aren't attentive to the moral content of what they're doing when they're sharing information with somebody else at all. So here, and I've kind of gone all the way back to Newman's Oxford University sermons, which are almost like a first draft of the Grammar of Assent. And he has a wonderful sermon about personal influence. So Newman reminds his hearers there that truth has been upheld in the world not as a system, not by books, not by argument, nor by temporal power, but by personal influence. And of course, as a Christian, Newman can appeal to the example of Christ himself, speaking with personally with people. There's a sanction in the incarnation for having a kind of humility and a kind of personal approach. So he says, such considerations lead us to be satisfied with the humblest and most obscure lot by showing us not only that we may be the instruments of much good in it, but that strictly speaking, we could scarcely in any situation be direct instruments of good to any besides those who personally know us. Whoever must form a small circle. It makes me think of the line from Milton's Paradise Lost, fit reader find though few. Newman in some ways it recognizes and is open to, even though as we now know today, has had a tremendous influence, but is also writing for a relatively small group of people and for intensely personal reasons. As I mentioned, his friendship with William Froude was one of the reasons that he spent 20 years writing the Grammar of Assent. It was in some ways writing a gift to and an aid to his friend William Froude. And a lot of Newman's other works are this way, that they bubble up from intense personal connection with other people. So that's my Newman-inspired approach to the post-truth era, to see the problem much more broadly as something that stretches out over several centuries going back. And also Newman as having a kind of a privileged place as a Victorian who was trying to, for the first time, integrate these two heritages and forge something out of them. So then crafting this personalist solution to the problem by recognizing the limits of inference, recognizing that certitude isn't the problem, affirming conscience, and remoralizing information sharing. And I really do think we began, as so many things with Newman do, by mentioning his motto, heart speaks unto heart. And in some ways, I think you can hang most of those points onto that phrase. It can be kind of a litmus test of if you are communicating in the way that Newman probably would have suggested for our post-truth era. So with that, hopefully I haven't taken too long, and we can move to some discussion. And I can even stop sharing.
Brett, that was fantastic. Your graphics were excellent, and you can tell that that's a gift you have. So in other words, it was a really nice set of PowerPoint slides that helped to clarify the information. We have a lot of people in the room. We have about 18 people. So please ask away and engage Brett on this lively discussion. Just before you ask your question, unmute yourself, and let's see what we got.
Hello, Brett. Bob Christie.
Bob.
Thank you very much, Brett. I really enjoyed that presentation. The way you integrated several fields specifically psychology, into an application of Newman. And the clarity was really superlative for all of that information. I have one question under the three causes that you mentioned at the outset. What would you think about adding academia to that?
That's a really interesting question. And it partly depends, I think, on which academics and what you mean. And I will say that the account that I mentioned of the post-truth era by Lee McIntyre, he does place a lot of the blame on postmodernism. And I tend not to go too far in that direction, partly because I think as many people who deal with postmodernism, I think there are good elements to it, partly because I think the modernist quest for certainty, for absolute certainty beyond any kind of doubt, I think that is, in fact, in that sense, Newman is not being a modernist in that kind of, he's not engaging in that Cartesian quest for bedrock certainty. I think he's doing something really different from that. So I guess that's a long way of saying I would hesitate to place the blame too much at the feet of just whatever we are calling postmodernism. But that certainly is an approach that some people take, Lee McIntyre being one of them. And I think there might be some legitimacy to that. You just have to be clear about what you mean by postmodernism. If we mean sort of just relativism and the way the academy has sort of advanced a relativistic approach, I would say that's a legitimate criticism of the academy, for sure.
Thanks, Brett. Just one other comment. David and I are editors of our new journal, and I was really impressed, very impressed with your talk. And after the conference, if you would be willing, I'd like to discuss with you the possibility of publishing this or a version of it in our journal.
Sure, certainly. Yeah, I'd definitely be open to that.
Okay, I'll get back to you after the conference. I think our members really would benefit from this very much.
Okay, great. Yeah,
okay, thanks, Brent.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Other thoughts, questions, remarks, comments?
And by the way, if anybody is interested, I put the link to the slides in the chat. I think that should get you to them. If anybody wants them or wants to look back through them, you're welcome to.
Ron, go ahead.
I have a question. Thank you very much for the clarity. I don't know, when you said certitude is not the problem, like it just jumped at me, and I started thinking, what could you mean? I presented a paper like 2 hours ago on doubt and how Newman is open, like his view of inquiry and how he allows doubts in many areas except in religion, like in religion. He believes that our assent to religious dogmas needs to be unconditional. And as I was like just thinking about it, trying to work out the ideas, I thought that maybe a problem today is that we're treating many other truths that are not religious dogmas as requiring unconditional assent. So yeah, like just the media and society ask us to be like very polarized and very absolute in our ideas. So that made me think that no, this notion of certitude is the problem. I can be quite uncertain about climate change, about the virus, about any issue on the table. All that is open for discussion, is open for development. So now the quotation, the phrase from Newman that you put, like, we have not yet attained the tranquil enjoyment of certitude, helped me understand what you were going, but could you speak a little bit more about like certitude not being the problem, or what do you mean?
Yeah, and I think there's just this, and it's kind of represented in the academic side by those two, conditions, the epistemic bubbles and the echo chambers. But I think in a more general sense, a lot of us assume that it's an ideologue that goes out and is too certain of everything that they believe, and they're going out and steamrolling other people, online, or they're advancing some kind of agenda. And so, yeah, I think it's really helpful to think that Newman is going to say, well, that's actually not certitude. That person hasn't achieved that kind of certitude. I don't know how that would be proven, but I often do think that we live in a world with such little trust, lack of trust in media institutions, governments, nonprofits of all kinds. And I think that there is an underlying, anxiety that's often driving somebody to become really certain of a conspiracy theory or something like that. And I think that might be a perfect illustration of what Newman has in mind. That person is actually driven by some underlying anxiety. It's not that they really have full certitude of that conspiracy theory, for example. I think that's kind of what he would be suggesting. And I do think, this is an interesting topic, and Newman I wish I could have said more about Newman and science, but Newman is such a good exemplar in that area too, when with new scientific findings. There's a great quote where he said, I think in a letter, about, two truths can't conflict with one another, but they often appear to conflict with one another. So what we really need is just patience. And so I think what Newman doesn't do is doesn't silence an opponent, or doesn't silence a perspective on truth, partly because he's not threatened by it. And he might even, I think he would go back to that point about, well, two truths ultimately can't be in conflict with one another. So sometimes we need to allow space. Or I think he also talks about, with his faith in particular, he'll talk about having or anticipating possible difficulties, like with the decision about papal infallibility. So he would have talked about that as in terms of having a difficulty with it, as opposed to having a doubt or rejecting it, or something like that. So I think he has good conceptual tools for what do you do with something that seems threatening to you, maybe.
Ron Snyder, you had a comment.
Yeah, thanks for a great paper. But could you comment on the, I guess, the trend of tipping over statues in our culture today as a post-truth piece, and would Newman comment on that? How would he comment on that?
That's a great question. I mean, yeah, I guess I would again be applying Newman to something that's so far outside, something that he would have imagined, because I think it's an American phenomenon. I don't know. I guess it's probably going on in other countries too, but it seems to be so specific to the heritage and legacy of the Civil War and the kind of lost cause rhetoric that was behind the creation of some of those statues. And so, but I tend to think that Newman, especially if you think about his perspective on like the development of doctrine, I don't think Newman is ever really a person who, he's able to embrace change and yet able to honor history and heritage and legacy. I don't know, I guess, so if I'm just speculating, I would think that he would be open to possible, discussions about, are we going to be, in order to move forward as I guess he would usually not be talking about it just in publicly, public statues, but I imagine if I put him in that context, he might be open to, discussions about it, always looking to kind of renew as you're rooted in heritage. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but yeah, I certainly think having the habits of mind of Newman helps us in those areas to develop authentically, to develop as a true growth out of, so not just tearing down the past, but moving from the past. So.
That's great. Thank you so much, Bud.
Thank you for that presentation, Brett. That was wonderful. I had a comment and then a quick question. It seems like there's different kind of shortcomings in our public discourse. You have the element of conspiracy theories. But one thing that I see among a lot of progressives, and you kind of touched on this, is that sometimes they assume the dispute is about believing or not believing in science, where really the dispute is about like the conclusions that are being drawn. So you can see this with COVID, but I think also with climate change. I'll sometimes see on social media, like, this person disagrees with my prudential judgments about how we handle this, therefore they don't believe in science. You see what I'm saying? It's almost like a categorical error. Even saying, do you believe in science, is kind of a weird way of thinking about, you know, like the knowledge that science makes available to us. And so a related comment, like one thing that I found really fascinating in your presentation that I've thought a lot about is how are human beings converted? Like, how do we change our minds? So I lived through a historic drought in North Carolina, and it was astounding to me because on the news, you would see like, well, we've got 28 days of drinking water left, and folks would still water their lawns. And until I think they like turned their faucet on and no water came out, that they weren't really going to modify their behavior. But then in some other areas, say like the way that Americans think about smoking, we have seen a tremendous change in our perception of that activity. So in your research, or maybe like even looking at Newman, do you have any thoughts about what kind of things precipitate societal, I guess, conversion, you'd call it, on pressing moral questions?
That's a great question. Yeah. Well, I think to start with the point about being accused of being anti-science, I think you put it really well, that, and Newman helps give us the language for that, you know, Notre Dame is opening this fall, and there's actually even Father Jenkins wrote a piece about it that's in the New York Times that's kind of interesting because it talks about using the science, but also it not getting you all the way to the decisions that you need to make, which is very much a Newman kind of point. So I think you're right that someone could disagree with a decision like that, a decision to open your university, which you make based on a lot of factors, one of which is the best available science at the time. But then that can easily be sort of, people can react against that as anti-science. So I think that's, yeah, when they're actually reacting to, as you said, your prudential judgment about what to do with the science. And yeah, I do think it's interesting too, there is research on this. Very few people are actually anti-science if what you mean by that is that they don't believe in the scientific method, they don't believe in the validity of observations. So, you know, so most people accept things like the germ theory of disease and, you know, a lot of things that seem actually fairly counterintuitive. So almost nobody is anti-science in the sense of thinking that it's not a valid field of inquiry. And I think sometimes by having a more humble approach to science and recognizing, as Newman says, it's part of its excellence is its validity within a limited range, I think helps us and helps everyone. It helps, you know, people not go more to the scientism route, and also doesn't make other people feel so threatened that they do react by rejecting some legitimate scientific findings on things.
Great, thank you. Bob?
Edward, on that point, would you see a difference between an attitude towards science and a problem in critical thinking? Because many people might be perfectly willing to accept the objective data of science, but yet, on the other hand, I think there's a pervasive failure in critical thinking in the culture. So I think, well, I just throw that out on the table for discussion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great thing to mention. And Newman, you know, has such an emphasis on philosophy being something that we use to integrate various disciplines. And I think in terms of what he would call philosophy, being if that is what we mean by critical thinking, then I think that certainly would be a solution to him. And I mean, I certainly think, obviously my background is in literature and having taught some writing and things like that. It's phenomenally powerful to teach students about the basics of logic and logical fallacies and things like that, so that when they are engaging in arguments, they're actually doing so productively. So I think in that sense, critical thinking is tremendously helpful.
Thomas Nagel, the NYU professor, calls philosophy the art of thinking. And many people take it for granted that thinking is pretty much a universally equivalent act, but that isn't the case. And that's where studying philosophy is a great tool, because it exercises that muscle of thought, and it can very much improve the capacity for regarding the quality of thinking.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
Well, let's thank you so much, Brett. That was a great presentation, and also stimulated a lot of really good comments.